Hey, this is Judah Mantel for SceneForge Studio, and in this video I'm going to go over version 0.6.20, which has some great improvements and new features to the fog system. So let's jump right in. So I have a scene here with a couple objects, and the fog system that I talked about in the previous video, and you can see I have it set to a green color. But there's a couple of changes that were made that will improve the photorealism and physicality of your scenes. So you might have noticed that in fog settings there's a new drop-down called Fog Mode. This allows you to switch between this current fog system, the horizon fog as I call it, and a new option called physical fog. Now this basically replaces that fog entirely with a new system that is volumetric and physically based, meaning that obviously you don't have as many control options other than the density, but it does take into account directly the time of day, rotation, and ambient lighting. So you can see as I increase this, the fog is much thicker and denser than the other one. It's much more all-encompassing throughout the entire scene. That's because this is simulating a physical fog effect, meaning that there are invisible particles in the air and the atmosphere that the objects will interact with. So for example, if I make the time of day a little bit lower and I rotate it so you can see the shadows, you can see as I rotate it, we have these light shafts, or you can see where the objects actually interact and intersect with our physical fog, which is really cool. Especially if I move this object over here, you can see the actual animated fog moving throughout. So it's not as customizable, but in some cases it adds for so much more photorealism than the other fog. It's worth noting two things though. One, it is not as performant as the horizon fog. So even though it may look better, it is certainly not going to perform as well because there's so much more to calculate with the physical nature of it. So on lower spec devices or MacBook devices, you're probably going to want to stick with the horizon fog. But regardless of your hardware configuration, if you're using an HDRI, for example, you're not going to want to use the physical fog simply because it's based on the procedural or real-time sky, and it's not going to be able to take into account the HDRI properties or image that you import. So for this example, I'll import one that we have been using here, and I'll set it quickly to this. All right. And you can see using the horizon fog, we can just select a color and control it as we want. But when I switch to physical fog, because it's taking into account this thing here at the time of day, it's not quite going to match up regardless of what I set. Because the fog is not going to take into account the image skybox. So for more realistic blending, make sure to use horizon fog, but if you're using a completely CG scene, you're welcome to use it for more realistic and improved results. Now, a couple other improvements to the way this physical fog works is that lights or individual lights, point lights, can now also have volumetrics enabled. Now, previously we have this volumetric spotlight beam. This is kind of more of a magic trick or an illusion to simulate the effect of a volumetric light beam, in that it looks really great and it works really well, but it's not quite actually interacting with the atmosphere. This is still here, and it works no matter what fog mode you have set. But for light bulbs or point lights, you can see that when I enable volumetric VFX, nothing will happen until I switch to physical fog and I increase the density. You can see now these light bulbs have this really great scattering in our atmosphere as I move it through the fog. Like this. And with this, you can do some really creative, really cinematic looking scenes because of this new system. And so with that, that is everything in version 0.6.20. I hope you'll get good use out of this new feature. I will see you in the next video.